tonight, together, feel some of that. In fact, let me tell you a little bit about my story as we move into some conversation. I'm a first-generation American. My mom was born and raised in Switzerland. She came here in 1949. That's actually a picture of her and her two siblings boarding a ship coming to New York in 1949. You know, she sits right there in the middle. And thank you, Hillary, I appreciate that. As a very young boy, my mother taught us the principles of the Constitution, what it means to be free. I mean, they came here because they believed in this experiment that they had heard about from across the ocean. They had heard about this idea, and they had heard about an experiment that had never been done before. And so they came here to be a part of that. And I read a book, my mom brought home a book when I was 13 years old. Many of you may be familiar with it. It's called "The Enemy Hath Done This." It's a book written by Ezra Taft Benson. And at 13 years old, I read that book. And here I sat in my bedroom in Mesa, Arizona, where I was raised, and I knew like I knew that this is what I was supposed to spend my life doing. That I was supposed to spend my life on the front lines defending the principles of freedom, moving the culture, inspiring people, being involved in whatever efforts I could be involved with. But I knew that's what I was supposed to be, one of many that was supposed to stand on the front lines. And so with that said, let's talk about some things and what it means to defend freedom. In fact, what we're going to talk a little bit about is, what does a constitutional republic look like? What does government look like under a constitutional republic? Why is the government established under the Constitution unique? We're going to talk a little bit about that. But let me give you some ammunition right up front. So I taught for 15 years at a couple different colleges down in Arizona, and I taught constitutional law, I taught criminal law, and I taught criminal justice. And on the very first day of class, I would go in, and remember, I'm spending 16 weeks with these students, 16 weeks, and I get 3 hours one night a week with them for 16 weeks. And what are we going to be talking about? We're going to be talking about the principles of limited government. We're going to talk about the history leading up to the drafting of the Constitution. We're going to talk about all of the various amendments: freedom of speech, free exercise of religion, freedom of assembly, the right to petition the government for redress. We're going to talk about the right to keep and bear arms. We're going to talk about the right to be left alone, Fourth Amendment principles, various trial rights found in the Fifth and Sixth Amendment. We're going to talk about equal protection under the law. And we're going to talk about various issues, very real issues. We're not talking about theoretical issues. I'm forcing my students to talk about real issues and how it relates to this document we call the Constitution. Now, here's what I will tell you. Most of my students that I taught came in, it should be no surprise, they came in with some pretty strange and warped ideas about what government should look like and what it even means to be free. In fact, I will tell you, I taught during the entire Obama administration. And so most of my students, the demographic that I was working with, most of my students were very much Obama supporters. Right? And I knew that. But listen, my job as a professor was not to indoctrinate them. Right. I knew that just by leading them through a discussion each and every week and asking the questions, that human beings, when they're introduced to the principles of freedom, they will side with the principles of freedom. And so here for 15 years, I would have conversations after class. Like I was working as an attorney during the day, and I was teaching from 7 to 10 at night, and I'm out in the parking lot at midnight talking with students, and this was one of the more common questions. Shane, well, they didn't call me Shane, they called Professor Krauser, right? Professor, why have I never heard these things before? That was the most common question. Why have I never heard of this idea of being left alone and that government has a limited role? I've never heard this stuff before. And so you had a feeling these students had a feeling of being duped. And yet most of my students had no idea where I stood. In fact, I remember having a Second Amendment discussion. We talked about the right to keep and bear arms. We spent 6 hours talking about that in my class, 2 class periods. And I remember Eli one year comes up to me after class, he says, "So Professor Krauser, where do you stand on this?" And yet, the overwhelming majority, almost unanimous, By the time we walked out of that class, wait a second, people do have an inherent right to defend themselves. People should have unfettered access to firearms. And that was just through the process of asking the right questions. And so, let me take you back to day one. And by the way, what I'm about to give you is something I use all the time. It's what I used out at Columbia University. It's what I use on the debate stage as I travel and debate other professors on various campuses. And it's this. I'll just use it in the context of my classroom. So imagine, I got 40, 50 students coming in, and I ask them, so who here wants to be left alone? Anybody here want to be left alone? In 15 years, I never had one student say, no, I actually don't want to be left alone. I think that other people can run my life better than I can. And I really like this idea of government intervening and them running my life for me. Never in 15 years. So it was unanimous. In every crowd I've ever been in front of, I've never had someone disagree, come up to me afterwards and say, you know what, I really don't want to be left alone. No, it's inherent within. When I say being left alone, I'm not talking about isolating ourselves in a room. I'm talking about the ability to choose how we want to live our lives. And so long as I'm not infringing on the life, liberty, or property of someone else, government should stay out of the game. Do you agree with me on this? Yeah. Right? That's the idea. And so here I had the overwhelming majority of my students that were buying into the Obama administration. By the way, when I might mention Trump. I want you to know I'm an equal opportunity hater. I don't care if you have an R behind your name, a D behind your name. Like, for me, the standard is the rule of law. It's the Constitution. And if you got individuals in office, I don't have allegiance to the individual. I have allegiance to the rule book. Right? So, but I look back at the Obama administration, all these students, I have the overwhelming majority of them saying, I want to be left alone. Guess what? They love freedom, and they don't even know it. So question number 2 was this. Who here believes that government should follow the rules? In 15 years, I never had one student say, no. The rule book should be flexible. Like, never. So every single student over the course of the 15 years, and I've done over 2,000 speaking engagements on freedom. And I've never had someone come up to me and say, government should have to follow the rules. Now, I want you to follow this. This is an amazing tactic that's worked so well. Now, the third question is this. Who here believes that you should be able to keep what you earn? Okay.
All of it.
Now, all of it, thank you very much. And I hear a little taxation and theft coming on from the back of the room, right? This is interesting because the majority, I would say probably 99% of my students agreed with that idea. But I want to take you back to Columbia University. I'm there. I had 600 students in an auditorium. And the first 2 questions, everybody agreed. And then the third question is, do you believe you should be able to keep what you earn? And of course, there were a few students that said, I disagree. Stand up. So there were 5 or 6 of them that I had them stand up. I said, I just want to be clear. Your belief is that an individual should not be able to keep what they earn. And one student chimed in something to the effect of no. Okay, well, what's the number? And, $250,000. Like, nobody needs more than $250,000. And so I said, you know what? And you can turn this off, unless we want, because I feel like I'm on a spotlight right now. Right? So here's what I asked them to do. I said, listen, I know that it is not cheap to go to Columbia. It's not cheap. I know you got money in that wallet. And I know in those backpacks you got Apple computers, you got phones, you got some stuff that's valuable. So here's what I'm going to do. I've got a podium right here. If you go ahead and take those things out, go ahead and bring them up on the podium. And here's what I promise you. When I'm done, we will go into the city and we'll go to a pawn shop. And we'll pawn those things off, and we'll take those resources, and I will go with you anywhere that you want to go to give those resources to people that you think are in need. We got a deal? So I'll go ahead and wait while you guys do that. How many think did it? No. Not one of them! Not one of them did that. Why? Because this whole idea of taking from others that have earned through a voluntary exchange is a cool idea until it applies to you. right? Until it requires you to give up something. Like I'm all about someone else giving up something and using government force to get someone to give up something. But me? Why should I have to do that? So most people don't even believe that idea, right? It's a cool idea. They believe they're taking the moral high ground, but they don't even believe that idea. And so now, we moved through those 3 questions, and now just watch how powerful this is. We're moving through the course, and we're going to the First Amendment. We're talking about freedom of speech. And I would always bring up very controversial cases, things like flag burning. I bet if we had a debate right here, there would be argument that would go down. Many of you that believe that flag burning is protected speech, and many of you that believe that, you know what, that's going too far. That should not be the kind of speech that's protected, and others would say that's not even speech. So why are we even having the discussion? But I would get into this debate with the class, and the students, it's very Socratic. So we talk about the scenario. And this particular scenario is individual, last name is Johnson, shows up at a rally and doesn't like what's being said. It's a Republican rally, and lights a flag on fire. And he is charged with an offense under a Texas statute. That basically you can't burn it couldn't desecrate a venerated object. I think that's something to that effect. And so that was desecrating a venerated object. The flag was defined as venerated. And so what happens is, he is convicted, and he appeals his conviction on what grounds?
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech. Who said that? Under freedom of speech. He appeals his conviction on the grounds that I have the freedom to speak, and Congress shall make no law. Government cannot do anything that infringes on that inherent liberty. And so, anyways, we have this discussion in class, and we're going back and forth. And what's interesting is a student would take a position, and I would bring them back to the first day of class. Wait a second here. Jim, here's what I'm hearing. You're taking this position, but on the first day of class, I asked you a question. Do you want to be left alone? And you said that you wanted to be left alone. And then I also asked you the question, should government follow the rules? And you said, yes, government should follow the rules. Tell me how your position falls in line with what you said on the first day of class. Here's what happens. And you can take any issue. We did this for 16 weeks. You had students that were starting to really analyze what it means to be free. Because what I was really teaching is tolerance for freedom. What is your tolerance for freedom? And I would ask you, what is your tolerance for freedom? Because I think so often we buy into this idea that I'm all about freedom so long as it's the kind of freedom that I agree with. If it's something that I would do, man, I'll stand behind you. But that, for me, that's not being a true freedom advocate. A true freedom advocate, high tolerance is the willingness and the ability to defend people exercising freedom in a way that you might find despicable. Think about that. In a way that you may find despicable. And so we can talk about a lot of things. I can think of a lot of things that I disagree with. A lot of things that I disagree with. And this is kind of an interesting balance, because on the one hand I'll say, I disagree with it, but the individual should have the freedom to do it. But then I want to be involved in the marketplace of ideas and say, I disagree. Let me just give you an example. In Arizona, it all started in Mesa. In Mesa, this was probably 30 years ago, they put up on the ballot that you could not smoke in a public facility. That went up on the ballot, and the people got to vote for it. Now, some of you may see a problem with that. You should not allow individuals, the people, to decide how a private business runs their business. Right? If we're a constitutional republic, we don't put rights up on the ballot and say, what do the majority think about it? But that's exactly what we did 30 years ago in Mesa. Is hey, should individuals be able to smoke in a private facility? So a sports bar. I'm running a mom and pop shop. I'm running a grocery store. And the people get to vote on whether or not I can have people smoking in my facility. And what did the people say? People say, no, you should not be able to smoke. And so they banned that across the board. And so what I would say is, number one, that decision's wrong, even though I'm morally opposed to smoking. I'm morally opposed to smoking, yet I would stand for the individual's right to decide how he wants to run his business. Right? To do that. But over here, I'm going to be involved in the marketplace of ideas, saying, I think smoking's dumb. Right? I don't think you should do it. And so you kind of see this balance going on, the ability to defend the liberty of the individual, but not abandoning your moral compass, saying, I want to be involved in the discussion. So I'll give you a, yes, go ahead.
What about medical segregation in the workplace?
So are you, okay, so great question. Let me ask you this.
Or medical apartheid?
Okay. Do individuals, let me just ask by raising a hand, are we in agreement that a private business should be able to decide how they run their business?
Yes.
Raise your hand if you agree with me. Okay. Would you agree with me that when a private individual goes about running their business, that of course, just like inside my home, let's switch the analogy for just a quick minute. In my home, can I tell people you can't bring a firearm into my home?
Yes.
Okay. So does anybody here run a private business? Okay. What is it that you do? Do you have a storefront by chance? Or do you just work out of the home? What do you do?
I have 4 businesses, but no storefront.
Okay. Does anybody have a storefront? What kind of storefront do you have?
Hair salon.
Hair salon. Okay. How long have you been doing it? 30 years. A long time. Do you do a good job?
Sure.
You do a great job. Well, do you do?
I've been in business 30 years.
Oh yeah, you're right. You're right. Well, listen. Do you do both men and women?
Yes.
Okay. I want you to imagine this. What's the name of your salon?
Salt Lake Airport.
Salt Lake.
Airport.
Ooh, that's pretty good. Salt Lake Airport. All right. So listen. I come in. What's your name?
Liz.
Liz. I come in. You cut my hair. And I'm like, I don't like this. I don't like what happened. So what happens is I come back the next day, and I'm out in front of your store with my picket signs, saying, the airport don't go to the airport. Like, don't go here. Liz, like, she talks a good game, but look at what happened. You don't go. And then I go inside her store, and she's got people sitting in the lobby, and I said, what are you doing here? Well, wait, why? She has no idea what she's doing. Not only does she have no idea by the way, I'm joking. Come with me on this journey, all right? She has no idea what she's doing, and not only doesn't know what she's doing, she's gonna take your money, and it's expensive. I'm telling you, I wouldn't do this. What does Liz do while I'm doing this?
Call us a police.
No, first Liz says, get out. And I say no. Right? So Liz, what does Liz do next?
Pulls out a 45.
I love it. So Liz calls, let's see, where's Sam Diamond? Sam Diamond. So look at Sam back here. Sam, how you doing? Yeah. So Sam, Liz says, Sam, get him out. And so what does Sam do? Sam comes to me and says,
Get out.
get out. And I say, I ain't going anywhere. And what does Sam do?
You're going to jail.
No, not quite. Don't go so fast. Right? What does Sam do? Now, Sam's not the police. He works with Liz. He's the office manager. Occasionally he cuts hair, and he does a terrible job too. Right? So what does Sam try and do? Now he can't catch me. I'm fast. Right? And Sam's coming to try and get me. I ain't leaving Sam, but Sam eventually carries me out. Do I have a First Amendment claim against the airport?
No.
Has Liz violated my First Amendment right of free speech? No. Here's my point that I think is important. I'm getting to your question, but I want to really extrapolate on this principle I think is important. When we're talking about the Constitution is a compact between who? The government and the people. The Constitution is not a compact between me and the airport. It's not a compact between me and my next door neighbor. And it's not a compact between me and Costco. So I saw a lot of this going on, that when Costco was requiring people to wear masks, what did you have going on? They're violating my constitutional right. They weren't violating any constitutional right. They were running a business as a private entity. That's what they were doing. There was no constitutional implication by what they were doing. And now I think some of you saying, oh shoot, because you're probably on Facebook, right? You might have been involved in some sort of rally. But you would hear that quite often. Well, they're violating our constitutional rights. And here's where I stood. I'm totally opposed to the mask mandate. Totally opposed to the vaccination mandate. That's where I stand. But where do I stand when it comes to Costco? I'm going to vote with my feet.
Yeah.
I'm going to vote with my feet. But I'm not going to infringe on what John Adams says is a fundamental principle. And if we abandon the fundamental principle of private property, say sayonara to all of your other liberties. So my point is this. When you start talking about mandates, medical mandates, let me tell you as I answer this question, I'm a purist. So our discussion tonight, I want to talk about a purist perspective. Not what laws are in place, the perspective of if the Constitution was being followed, if we are adhering to the principles of freedom, what should the answer be? And my answer is simply this. Let businesses run the business the way they want to run it. If a business says we're going to have a medical mandate, let them do it, right? Here's the problem. That's kind of the high level, almost ethereal type perspective. But here's the reality, though, at the same time, that many of these businesses are being funded by the government, and when funded by the government, they're no longer a private entity in that sense. Are you following me here? This is important. This is important. Think about it from this perspective. So I was a prosecutor for 12 years. I spent half of my career in the gang homicide unit, chasing down bad guys, dealing with really horrific crimes. I want you to imagine, law enforcement officer is going to approach and talk to a suspect, and his intent is to take him into custody. Follow me on this. His intent is to take him into custody. Now, we all know that before a police officer can question somebody who is in custody, he has to read him his rights. We can have a fun discussion on whether or not the Constitution actually requires that. But let's just go with with the current rule of law. So the police officer says, no way, if I go and pick him up and start to question him, he'll never talk to me. So what I'm going to do is I go to my neighbor, and I go to Shannon, and I say, Shannon, your neighbor, we want to get some information from him, and we know he won't talk to us. But would you mind going over and just having, you're friends with him, having a casual conversation, and ask him about where he was on June 18th? And ask him about whether or not he owns firearms. And then ask him about what kind of firearms he owns. And then maybe bring up the name of the person who passed, right? Just ask these types of questions. Now, let's say that she does that. Is Shannon a private individual in that situation?
No.
She's an arm of the government. She's an arm of the government. So this is really important when you start talking and analyzing what's going on culturally right now with the medical mandates and everything else going on. I know it's a tough pill to swallow, that I don't want to be insensitive to the reality that lives are being affected in really significant ways. I'm just telling you what the rule of law, what freedom says, is businesses should be able to run their business the way, regardless of the decisions they might make. But once they're tied with government, the analysis is different. It's very much different because now we're talking about life, liberty, property. And I believe that right now what we're seeing the courts do is strike down many of these. Like the momentum is in our favor right now. Let me just give you another perspective on this. Do you all remember back, this was probably 7, 8, 9 years ago, when you had a same-sex couple went to a baker.
Yeah.
You remember that?
Yeah.
That baker was, they said, hey, we want you to bake cakes. And she said, well, what for? For a wedding. And she got some information about the wedding, and she found it was a same-sex wedding. And she says, I'm not going to do that because I don't leave my moral or religious code at the door. And so what do? They file a lawsuit. What do you think about that? Should she be able to decide how she runs her business? Yes, right? You don't leave the free exercise of religion at the door. And so here, I was on NBC Nightly News on this particular issue. Arizona had passed what they call SB 1062. And SB 1062, there was no need for it because the First Amendment is very clear. Congress shall make no law that inhibits the free exercise of religion. But yet Arizona did something that they did at the federal level and many states had followed. And the idea was that an individual who's running a business does not have to abandon where they stand religiously when they go about running their business. Now, NBC Nightly News comes running into town because there's all these protests taking place down in the Phoenix Capitol. And the Republicans had passed it. And so NBC Nightly News, along with other media organizations or outlets, is trying to get a hold of these Republican legislators. Where'd they go? They were nowhere to be found. They were nowhere to be found. They didn't want to have the debate. Why? Because they were concerned about the common thing that we might be concerned about. Oh, what do you mean? You have issues with immigration, you're a racist. Oh, you have issues with forcing an individual who's baking a cake on behalf of a same-sex couple. You have a problem with that? You're a bigot. You see, and so we don't know how to deal with those sorts of allegations. And so I gladly went on to NBC Nightly News to do this. Because this is a relatively easy argument to make. Because remember, there were other things going on. You had a photographer. Yeah. A photographer that was asked to take pictures at an event where she had some moral hesitation. Now, I'm not going there. That's in opposition to my religious worldview. I'm not doing it. So you had all of these people being sued. And while I was on Nightly News, I flipped the switch. I said, I want to be very clear on something. What I'm suggesting is I am not advocating that what these business owners are doing is the right thing. What I am advocating is that they have the right to do it. And we, the people, can march with our feet if we don't like it. If we, the people, disagree with what they're doing, we can put them out of business very quickly. So if we believe that she's a bigot and the masses agree with that, she goes out of business. That's what I believe should happen in the free market. That government shouldn't be able to come in and dictate how individuals decide to run their business. Let the free market decide. And then I said, listen, I stand in the same position with an individual who is a gay taxi driver. And they pick up someone in the East Valley of the Phoenix area, and the taxi driver says, where are you going? He says, I'm going down to the Capitol. And the driver says, for what purpose? He says, there's an anti-gay rally going on down there. I want to make sure that the legislature doesn't move on certain legislation that they're considering. And what does the driver say? Get out! Guess what? I stand with him. Let him decide. And so it was interesting because as we flipped the switch, NBC Nightly News, they had an agenda. Yeah. Their agenda was not freedom. But when they heard a freedom fighter, a freedom advocate, defending the other side just the same, what do you say to that? You no longer have the defense of you're a racist, you're a bigot, you're a misogynist. You no longer have that defense. So